Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be showing you how I turned this dress into this dress. And I wanted to give a huge shout out to my friend Alex, who actually gave me this dress. Her mom was clearing out a ton of her stuff from the 80s and decided to send it my way, which thank God she did, because this was such a fun transformation, going from the really intense 80s shoulder pads to something more my speed. And I'm really excited to share this tutorial as well, because there are a few things that I'd practiced before on muslin but never actually executed on a final dress, including the welt pockets as well as lining with an invisible zipper. Truth be told, I should have crossed that bridge a long time ago, but was kind of just avoiding it, and it's actually so simple. So we'll be going over all of that in this tutorial, as well as the actual construction of the dress. And as always, the printable PDF will be linked in the caption below, so please let me know if you have any issues printing that out, but it should be pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. So to start with, I'm seam ripping all of the panels apart and removing the shoulder pads, as well as these beautiful fabric covered buttons and the zipper. And I know this step can be very tedious and it's so tempting to just cut down the panels instead, but trust me, when it comes to cutting out the pattern, you're going to be so happy that you preserved these extra inches by seam ripping instead of cutting. I love this step because I think it's so interesting to see how the garment was constructed, and it can inform how you're going to construct the garment that you're actually making. So with this fabric, I realized the neckline actually had fusible interfacing, which made me realize I needed to add fusible interfacing to the pocket pieces because they needed that structure. Go ahead and iron all of those panels flat, and then we can start cutting out our pattern pieces. I usually like to cut out the larger pattern pieces and then move on to the smaller pieces just to be safe. And I'm also gonna go ahead and cut out my lining pieces for this bit. Unfortunately, the lining of this dress was actually really poorly made. It was a really cheap fabric and it also didn't match very well. So I actually picked up some of my own lining fabric and I'll be using that instead. I cut out all of the exterior panels and lining panels using the same pattern. And I also used the lining fabric to cut out the pocket interior. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be adding fusible interfacing to my pocket pieces. If you're working with a fabric that's denser and has more structure, you don't need to do this step, but my fabric was very flimsy and I definitely needed to add the fusible interfacing to be able to have enough structure in the pocket. If you're going to add fusible interfacing, take the textured side of the fusible interfacing and place it face down on the back side of the fabric. Iron it down, but make sure the iron never comes in direct contact with the fusible interfacing. So either place a piece of fabric in between or flip it over and iron on the front side of the fabric itself. I prefer to iron the fusible interfacing to a large panel and then cut it out, but some people prefer cutting out the fusible interfacing and cutting out the fabric. I just like to save time and do it all in one cut. For each welt pocket, which there are 2 in this pattern, you should have 1 pocket interior, 2 strips, and 1 pocket flap. So in total, you'll have 2 pocket lining pieces, 4 pocket strips, and 2 pocket flaps. Go ahead and take that pocket flap and fold it hot dog style with the fusible interfacing facing outward. Iron it, again, being sure the fusible interfacing does not come in direct contact with the iron. Then sew down the edge using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once that's done, it should look like this. Trim the bottom corner so that you can turn it right side out. Flip it right side out and push out each of the corners, then iron it flat. Set both pocket flaps aside. We'll come back to that in just a moment. For now, we're going to move to the dress itself. Take the front panel and the side panel and sew them together along the side seam. Using a fabric disappearing ink marker, measure 2 inches below where this notch begins and leave a mark to indicate where your stitch should stop. Just to be clear, you're going to continue that stitch down as if the flap wasn't there at all. So that flap's about 2 inches wide and the edge of the other piece. Lily. Okay, brief deer break because Lily just spotted them and scared the shit out of me. They're so cute. Okay, so as I was saying, we're going to continue that stitch as if that flap wasn't there at all. So when you take the front panel and lay it onto the side panel, the raw edge of the front panel should be 2 inches from the edge of the flap. And we're going to continue the stitch using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Add the bust dart by folding the triangle in half and sewing along that line. Iron it flat and repeat on both sides. Once you've done both sides, we're going to sew up that front center seam, again using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now this is a moment of truth. I'm going to be so honest with you guys. I drafted this pattern and tested it in muslin, but did not practice adding the welt pocket to the dress itself. So I was kind of winging it a little bit, just pinning the flaps onto the dress and trying to eyeball it to make sure they were centered. But truth be told, this is not the best way to go about doing this. This will not be a problem for you if you're following the pattern that I linked below, because I did indicate on the pattern where the welt pockets will be going. But yeah, I guess I've said it before and I'll say it again. I am not perfect and sometimes I'm winging it. If you hear that water, no, it is not somebody peeing. It is my garden. Once I was happy with where I pinned those flaps, I grabbed the strips that I cut out earlier and folded them all long ways with a fusible interfacing facing inward and ironed them flat. Taking the folded strip, I placed it right above the flap with the raw edge facing downward towards the ground. I pinned that into place, then removed the flap and added the other strip with the raw edge facing upward, mirroring the previous strip. Once that's complete on both sides, sew along the raw edge of each strip using 1/4 inch seam allowance and stop 1/2 inch short of the end of the strip. When you're done, it should look like this, and as you can see, the end of the strip can lift off of the fabric because it's not sewn down. I use my fabric marker again to indicate where the stitch should end, which I recommend doing, or pinning to indicate where to stop. Get your ruler out again and measure another 1/2 inch away from where the stitch ends. So it should be 1 inch total from the end of the strip itself. We're going to cut down the center line and stop when we get to that marking. It should look like this. Now continue the end of the cut to the end of the stitch, making a triangle like so. Be sure you're only cutting through one layer of fabric and not cutting through the strips on the other side. Take the flap that we set aside from earlier and pin it along the top strip with the raw edges facing down. Sew along the raw edge again using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once that's complete, flip the strips inside the garment and iron it flat. It should look like this. Take that little triangle flap that we cut earlier and sew it in place along the end of the strips. Now to add the pocket lining. Take the top of the pocket lining and pin it to the top edge of the strip on the inside of your garment. Then flip it over and pin the bottom side to the bottom strip. Again, I'll show it here. I'm just pinning it flat, folding that lining in half and pinning the bottom side. Sew along the edge of the lining fabric, being sure not to go through the front of the garment itself. When you're done, it should look like this. Now close off your pocket by sewing from the end of the stitch to the bottom of your pocket. When you're done, there shouldn't be any holes on the pocket interior and it should look like this. Now give yourself a pat on the back or a round of applause or I don't know, a little sweet treat, because that was honestly one of the hardest parts of making this garment and you got through it. So congratulations, and we'll just keep plowing along. So now we're going to be attaching the back panel. I'm going to draw in that back dart, and of course there is an easier way to do this. Again, I am not always the best model of how you should do this. If you have transfer paper, definitely use that, but I was all out, so I just drew this dart right in and again went ahead and sewed that into place. Then I took the front of my garment and attached the back panel along that outer edge, this time going all the way from the very top to the very bottom. Again, I'm using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I went ahead and repeated all of those steps on the lining fabric. So again, stopping just below that notch. Once you sew all of the lining panels and outer panels together, you should be left with 2 pieces that mirror each other. Place both of the front facing sides against each other and sew along that center V underneath the arms and along the back of the neck, stopping 1 inch short of where the zipper will be added. Again, I'm using 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm basically using 1/4 inch seam allowance for all of these with the exception of adding the zipper. Go ahead and cut some notches into that armhole curve, that way you can turn it right side out without having any problems. Flip the garment right side out and wiggle the stitch out of the ditch, that way you can iron it flat. I like to separate the 2 pieces like this and iron it flat, and then wiggle that stitch out and iron along the edge. When you're done, you should have a really clean finish that looks like this. Now take your invisible zipper. I'm using the 20 to 22 inch invisible zipper that I purchased. I didn't want to use the original zipper from the previous garment because it was not an invisible zipper. Iron the teeth of the zipper away from the zipper tape edge, and when you zip it up, it should be folded in on itself like so. With the front of your zipper facing downward, pin the left side of the zipper to the right side of the back, starting at the top and continuing down. Sew along that edge, getting as close to the edge of the zipper itself without puncturing the zipper. If you have an invisible zipper foot, this would be a great time to apply it, but mine has been MIA, so I just used a very narrow zipper foot and that worked just as well. Continue the stitch down until you reach the end and can't go any further, then back tack and move to the other side. At this point, your zipper should look like this. With the zipper facing upward, unzip the zipper and flip the zipper teeth outward. Pin the zipper tape at the top, being sure you're aligned with the other side, and continue the stitch along the edge just as we did previously. Once the zipper is sewn in on both sides, move the zipper out of the way and continue the stitch down the bottom of the panels using 1/2 inch seam allowance so it seamlessly continues from the zipper to the bottom of the panel. Push the seam allowance open and iron it flat. That way the end of the zipper tape aligns with the bottom of the seam allowance. Zip the zipper up and stitch alongside the zipper tape, continuing it onto the seam allowance, being sure not to go through the front side of the garment. When you're done, it should look like this. Now to attach the lining. Flip the garment inside out and continue that stitch that we stopped short of earlier. Be sure to sandwich the zipper tape between the outer fabric and the lining fabric and continue all the way to the edge. Now align the raw edge of the lining fabric with the raw edge of the outer fabric, again sandwiching the zipper tape between the two, and sew along that edge until you reach the bottom. For this, I'm using 1/4 inch seam allowance instead of 1/2 inch seam allowance, and when you're done, it should look like this. Now all of the raw edges are concealed on the interior. Now we're gonna move on to the sleeves. Placing the straps together with the front facing sides facing each other, I sewed using 1/2 inch seam allowance, then double folded the raw edge under and added a top stitch 1/4 inch away from the seam. Part of me kind of wishes I would have used French seams here, and if I was working with a different fabric, I probably would have, but I was afraid the French seams would look too bulky and be too visible with this fabric. Now we are so close to the finish line. We are basically almost done. The next step is just to add a double rolled hem to all of the remaining raw edges for the lining and the outer fabric. I started with the little slit that we had in the front of the dress and rolled it very tightly, did 1 stitch along the edge, and then trimmed that excess, ironed it flat, and then folded it over again and added another stitch. That way the raw edge was rolled up inside. I repeated that step along the slit and the bottom of the garment for the lining and the outer fabric. And that's pretty much it. So congratulations if you've made it this far in the tutorial. As always, I do have a few critiques of my own work. One of which being, I don't know if I would add welt pockets to a fabric like this again. I think it kind of worked out, but definitely warped a little bit. I think this would work much better on a fabric that had a little bit more structure. And even though I added that fusible interfacing, it didn't fully compensate for the fabric itself, not really being cut out for this type of thing. You'll probably notice if you look up welt pockets, 99% of the time they're using a cotton, a linen, it's on suiting, it's on things that have more structure and not on this flimsy material. And again, this is where I wish I would have taken more pointers from the original dress. So if we look back at the original dress, they were really utilizing this fabric's ability to drape really nicely. And that's something I probably should have considered. I think this fabric does a better job draping, and the structure that I was requiring it to have was really forced. I had a few hiccups with this project and with this fabric, and it's because I was pushing it into a territory that it really did not want to go to. But all things considered, I am pretty happy with how this dress turned out, and I would love to see your results. So if you follow this tutorial, please tag me, please comment below, please email me, DM me, carrier pigeon, however you wish to reach me. I would love to see it. It brings me so much joy to see people following these tutorials and using my patterns. So please let me know, and please subscribe if you enjoyed this tutorial. Thank you so much, and I hope all of you have such a lovely day.